Yo, and welcome back to In Search of a Way. Good to see you again. I'm recording this on Thursday, January 28th, the feast, if you're a Roman Catholic, of St. Thomas Aquinas. This guy, this champion of classical theism that I've been talking about. Well, what I've been talking about is what the statement God exists means for the classical theist. Last time we talked a little bit about apophaticism, where the idea is that we stress what God is not. For the classical theist, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to preserve the intuition known as divine transcendence. What is divine transcendence? Divine transcendence just means different, other. Divine transcendence refers to God's complete otherness. And a few of you, I don't know why you did this, a few of you have sent me write-ups on McCabe's article saying that McCabe thinks God is everything. And you may have gotten a little note from me back saying, I'm not happy that you wrote that. McCabe, classical theists like Herbert McCabe don't say God is everything. They're more inclined to say God is nothing. God's not one of the things, let alone all of the things. So God is completely different, completely unlike anything. Okay, well, the classical theistic tradition has come up with a couple of ways of cashing out divine transcendence, and that's what this lecture is about. The two-pronged strategy for talking about divine transcendence is A, divine simplicity, and B, divine eternity. Today I'm going to teach you what both of those phrases mean. Let's put them on the board. Oh, I'm sorry, what was that? Oh, you did. You're one of the students who wrote God is everything? Okay. Now, don't beat yourself up. You made a little mistake, okay? You just got to be a little more careful about these things. Divine simplicity. If you've, I know some students Google me, my name, before they take my class. If you did that, depending on how far you went, you may have seen that I'm known as a divine simplicity scholar. That's what I write and research and publish about. Nevertheless, today you're getting like the real simple version of all my research. Okay, both of these things are big topics with lots of nuances and lots of complications. Simplicity, divine simplicity is rather complicated. Um, I'm giving you the easy, straightforward, what I want you to be thinking about for the theology class version of these theories. If you want to learn more details, if you want to learn the ins and outs of the arguments for these, and if you want to learn some criticisms that have been launched of these, great news! You can study with me next year in a class called Faith and Reason. Register for Faith and Reason with Kovac to learn all of the fun details about divine simplicity. I said that for the classical theist, God is creator. And I've said that what that means is that everything depends on God. Not God is everything. Everything depends on God. And God depends on... There's nothing God depends on. God doesn't depend. Let's say it that way. I could have said God depends on nothing. And that would have been right, but I'm even more comfortable saying God doesn't depend. Do you know why? Can you see why? Can you think about why? Think about why. Do a little bit of jotting down there in the comments box. Why does Kovac, in his sage wisdom, think it's better to say God doesn't depend than to say God depends on nothing? Okay, but that's not really what this lecture is about. What's this lecture about? Well, Let me explain it this way. Let me tell you a little secret. Simplicity is a negation word. Simplicity won't tell us what God is, but it's going to tell us what God isn't. And what it tells us is that God isn't composite. Simplicity means not composite. What's composite mean? Composite means put together. Put together out of different parts. Divine simplicity, just memorize what I'm about to say. Divine simplicity means God has no parts. You see, if you're a composite, if you have parts, you depend on your parts. What are some of your parts? Well, you have a left half and a right half. And if I take your left half apart from your right half, you will cease to be instantly. I've tried getting a grant. You want me to prove it? I've tried getting a grant. I asked the Templeton Foundation for $2 million. And I said for $2 million, what I was going to do was get an assistant. I would pay the assistant an annual stipend of $90,000. And what I was going to do was use some of the money, probably about $11, to go get an axe. And I was going to chop the assistant down the middle, left half split from the right half, and see if my assistant still existed. And how would I see if my assistant still existed? I would see if my assistant cashed the paychecks for that $90,000. Well, the Templeton Foundation declined my request to cut a human being in half. But I'd be willing to bet. If you take a thing apart, it ceases to exist. Now, material parts, physical parts like left and right, are easy to think about. Let's think about some other ways you depend. Are you a good person? If you're a good person, you depend on goodness. You depend on there being such a thing, such a way of being as goodness. So that's a way you depend. That's a way you're a composite. There's you plus your property of goodness. Well, divine simplicity tells us God depends on nothing, not even on the property of goodness. What this means is that if God is good, and we usually say in the monotheistic traditions, God is good, it means God just is God's goodness. And if God has knowledge, God just is God's knowledge. You're not identical to your knowledge. You forget things, you learn things. But God just is identical to God's knowledge. And here are the slogan for divine simplicity. Famous slogan, which I'd like you to know. The famous slogan for divine simplicity. Whatever is in God is God. Whatever is in God is God. What's in you? Here's something. We don't mean physically located in you, but in you, like your knowledge is in you. Your love for your parents is in you. Humanity is in you. But they're not you. They're not identical. Somebody else can love your parents, which means that you're not identical to your love for your parents. You're not identical to humanity. If you were identical to humanity, then if I was a human, I'd be you. So whatever is in God is God. And ultimately what that means is God is God's own divinity. See, I'm going to tell you about one more dependence relationship. You depend on your species, your kind. Not the members of your species, I mean the species itself, humanity. If there was no such thing as humanity, well then there could be no humans, which would mean there would be no you or me. So God is divinity. Not God has divinity. You have humanity. I have humanity. God doesn't have divinity. God is divinity. So, divine simplicity is one way that God is radically unlike stuff, unlike things, unlike anything. Everything other than God is in some way a composite. Everything other than God has some sort of dependency relationships. Everything other than God either depends on physical parts, like a top and a bottom or a left and a right. Everything other than God depends on maybe conceptual parts, like I depend on my humanity. And everything other than God might depend on properties, like goodness, knowledge, your love for your parents, and so on. But God depends on nothing. Whatever is in God is God. Now, if everything depends on God, as the classical theist maintains, well, then there's one really interesting thing that depends on God. Time! It's that time to learn about divine eternity. What is divine eternity? Well, here's what theologians mean when they talk about eternity in this tradition. It has 4 parts. Complete possession of life all at once, without end or beginning. So, no beginning and end. That's part of eternity, but that's not the whole story. Life is actually part of something that's eternal, right? When we talk about something eternal, we talk about something that is in some way, not a biological life, but something that has a life. Something that has a life. Or in God's case, is God's own life. Because whatever is in God is God. Complete possession, all at once, of life without beginning or end. You have a past, a present, and a future. Your life consists of befores, afters, and simultaneities. Before you were a college student, you were a high school student. After you're a college student, you'll have a job, perhaps. We hope. And while you're a college student, or at least while you're in your 2021 college year, there's a pandemic happening. That's simultaneous with you right now. Befores, afters, durings. Your life is just made up of one thing after another. You can't get the past back, and the future doesn't exist yet. Your life has to stretch out that way. God's life doesn't, because God doesn't depend on time. If simplicity tells us God is not composite, eternity tells us God is not temporal, not a time being. There's no befores and afters in God. God occupies. It's not even that. So divine eternity doesn't even mean that God always exists. Although it's true to say that in 1784, the statement God exists was true then. Unlike, say, the statement Donald Trump exists. That wasn't true in 1784. They were much happier for it. God doesn't occupy places in time. You and I occupy places in time. God doesn't occupy a place in time. God is outside of time, so to speak. Just like God is outside of space. So what one way of thinking about this is that for God doesn't foreknow the future. Does God know what's going to happen to you tomorrow? Absolutely, God knows what's going to happen to you tomorrow. But God doesn't foreknow it. I know something that will happen tomorrow. What do I know will happen tomorrow? The moon will be going around the earth tomorrow. I would say that I know that. I would say I foreknow that. I know that's something that's going to happen tomorrow. I know it based on how things are now. God doesn't foreknow that the moon is going to rotate the earth tomorrow. God doesn't figure it out, right? God knows everything because God's already there. And when I say already there, I don't mean to imply that God has a place in time. I mean to say that God's created everything. That's all that means. God doesn't have a past or a future. God doesn't even have a present, although sometimes we talk about divine eternity as a complete possession of the present. God's entire life, so to speak, is completely present to God at every point of God. In many ways, divine eternity is simply an application of divine simplicity to time. Divine simplicity wants to get rid of all parts in God, all compositionality in God. Divine eternity simply points out that time is a kind of compositionality. There's a real sense in which you're composed out of temporal parts. Your past, your present, your future. That's what your life is made of. God's life is not made of past, present, future. God has God's entire life all at once, perfectly, no beginning, no end. Last things to say about divine transcendence. Notice that neither divine simplicity nor divine eternity tell you what God is like. These are not meant to help you think more clearly about what God is. These are meant to show you just how utterly ignorant we are in this life of God. Any attempt to think about God is going to prove impossible. Why? Well, think of it this way. Play 20 questions with me. Can you play 20 questions with me? I'm thinking of Quattlepuck. You want to know what Quattlepuck is? Well, what's the first thing you ask if you want to know what Quattlepuck is? You ask if it's a person. I say, no, it's not a person. Is it a mineral? No. Place? No. Is Quattlepuck a vegetable? No. An event? No. Okay. Imagine playing 20 questions with me, and every question you ask, I answer no. That's what these doctrines of classical theism are doing. Divine simplicity, and also divine eternity, are meant to show us that when you play 20 questions with a classical theist who's thinking about God, all you're going to get is no. That's what a classical theist looks like when they play 20 questions and are thinking of God. Anything you ask, because they can't think of God, strictly speaking. Anything you ask them, they're going to say, no, God's not a person, God's not one of the things, God's not an animal, right? Divine simplicity is meant to show us that all the ways we have of thinking about something, any category we can ever put something into, God escapes. Yes, the statement God exists is true. Yes, there's a God worth worshiping, a God worth speaking of in theology. However, all of our speaking about God is going to be seriously messed up because God's not one of the things there to be spoken about in an ordinary way. Okay. So far, everything I've told you is something that's agreed upon in classical Jewish, Christian, and Islamic theology, the three monotheistic religions. Next time, we're going to start zooming in on Christian theology, because I'm going to tell you about some little surprises known as Trinity and Incarnation. See you next time!